Yeah, good afternoon. Many thanks to Ireland at the Fordham Humanitarian Lecture Series and the Fordham University Institute for Humanitarian Affairs for giving me this opportunity. I'll present based on operational challenges and less on the legal approaches to interacting with non-state actors and de facto authorities. And just look at this for the purpose of being able to deliver humanitarian assistance to vulnerable people, often caught up in conflict and often in territories not controlled by a legitimate or recognised government. And from my own personal experience, I'll focus on working in the areas controlled by Houthis and Hamas in Gaza. I mean, obviously today, although all roads lead to COVID-19, both politically and socially, and obviously the economic and humanitarian situation is very obvious. I will have to speak about the sort of humanitarian access at a time when COVID-19 is changing our world and the way we operate, and as part of the access challenges we face in humanitarian settings, wherever we work. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has upended society, bringing the economy of entire countries to a halt and threatening the lives of tens of millions, and those people in conflict zones all the more tragic for them. My current position as the UN Resident Humanitarian Coordinator in Palestine, COVID-19 has changed the long-standing paralysed political dynamics, perhaps temporarily or perhaps longer, it remains to be seen. The non-political nature of the COVID pandemic created, maybe for the first time ever in Palestine, an imperative for broad cooperation between all the sides, Israel, the Palestinian authorities and Hamas. I think, in other words, the self-interest of all concerned now drives the need to cooperate on containment and distribution of equipment and materials. Even more than the destructive aftermath of the 2014 war, the COVID crisis has opened doors for Israeli facilitation of access of goods, of equipment, etc., previously unimaginable. So much so that the Israelis itself is contributing with in-kind assistance into Gaza. There are many threats, as we know, to the humanitarian assistance that we do worldwide. I think the two main challenges are more the political grip on humanitarian funding and humanitarian access. Reductions in funding globally is occurring as humanitarian needs grow and is linked increasingly to humanitarian assistance and the choices based more on political considerations than before. And I think this is obviously impacted by the growing world disorder we face and the end of the golden age of multilateralism. The other biggest obstacle facing humanitarians is access. In many of the countries we operate, we can't deliver food and other things because of political obstacles. For example, during the height of the war, to deliver aid in Syria, agencies cooperated with whatever limits President Assad wants to impose. That includes with, which agencies we can deliver through and where the aid can go. Obviously, aid was not delivered easily to areas that were opposing him, and therefore it makes it difficult to deliver aid neutrally, impartially and independently. But we see the same situation in many places where oppositions want to stop humanitarian agencies from delivering aid or divert. Humanitarian access is about finding ways to reach people who need assistance. But it's not that easy when control over territory and armed conflicts are in play. It's simple, but it's very complex. Non-state actors and governments all try to exert control, influence over access on the recipients and on the actual aid itself. In this context, I'll address access issues of the newest crisis in the Middle East, Yemen, where I was based before starting to work in Palestine, which is the oldest, longest standing humanitarian political crisis in the region. Both face similar geopolitical challenges and dynamics and a similar root cause. Thus, we may find similar lessons that can be drawn to address access in both of these situations. Engaging with non-state actors and de facto authorities for humanitarians is increasingly important, as the majority of the conflicts in which the humanitarian actors operate are present. Security incidents affecting aid workers have more than tripled over the past decade. There's a growing concern over the role of non-state actors and the role they have in this type of insecurity. And moreover, when non-state actors control territory and therefore access to populations, humanitarians have to negotiate access in order to deliver that aid. Yet the vast majority of humanitarian agencies fail to engage effectively with non-state actors, and it's the aid workers and those people who are in need of help that face the detrimental consequences of that lack of engagement. The growing counter-terrorism legislation is a new emerging threat that affects our work with non-state actors. Countering terrorism and the war on terror is a foreign policy imperative, mostly created by the United States, but also many major donors now through the humanitarian organisations are part of that as well. The onus tends to be on implementing agencies, whether from the UN system or individual non-government organisations, to fall into line. And the pressure to adhere to for the UN system or these individual organisations is heavy. The pressure from the governments and the foreign policy agenda is very much linked to the humanitarian funding as well. Humanitarians see this as an unrecognised consequence of the war on terror, and has this effect on the ability for humanitarian organisations to reach people in need. I mean, most humanitarian organisations, as we know, are highly dependent on government funding, which limits their operational independence because of that. They often choose to accept funding with restrictive counter-terrorism clauses as part of the bargain. And after years of global focus on the threat of terrorism, the public and the media are understandably wary of any risk that aid can be diverted from those in need to those affiliated with the armed groups. Fear of even the slightest diversion damaging the reputation of organisations creates undue pressure to accept the premise and the procedures of government-funded aid programmes. And especially in the case of Israel and Palestine, there are individuals and advocacy groups out there prepared to attack the legitimacy of these organisations based on real and sometimes imagined violations of counter-terrorism legislation. We have, in fact, a sort of a clash of cultures, of political agendas rubbing uncomfortably up against the humanitarian principles. The premise of counter-terrorism legislation is that humanitarian agencies don't distinguish between armed groups, armed actors, including designated terrorist groups and civilians. And in these agencies make every effort to do so, to carry out their missions in keeping within humanitarian principles. Not easy. And far from trying to evade or work around counter-terrorism regulations, humanitarian organisations devote an increasing amount of time and resources to comply with the complex and ever-changing regulatory regime in which they are forced to assume all the risk. Some humanitarian organisations have fallen foul and have been involved in costly legal battles over allegations of allowing donor aid to end up in the pockets or in the control of non-state actors. Humanitarian organisations and agencies that do engage with non-state actors are often hesitant to admit they do so, particularly when such groups are labelled as terrorists, and they are often reluctant to share their experience with other aid workers or publicly speak about them. And I think in 2016, when Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General at the time, convened the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, it was the first type of a humanitarian gathering of that kind. And it was set up to identify solutions to the most pressing challenges in meeting the needs of affected populations affected by conflict and disasters, and at the same time to try and create an agenda for the humanitarian world to be much more able and much more nimble in terms of dealing with the crisis and the humanitarian action fit for purpose and fit for the future. We know that 1,000+ recommendations later, the summit is now a distant memory, but the problems it set out to address, I think, continue to fester. I think one of the important groups that was missing throughout the consultations, the 2 years leading up to the summit, was that they weren't consulted, and that was the non-state actors. And I think in this regard, it was a sort of a lost opportunity. Clearly, these actors couldn't be present. I don't think that was the case, but I think that more research could have been done in terms of what the current state of affairs was and how to try and help enrich the conversation around some of the challenges that humanitarians face today. But perhaps one of the main successes of the summit was the fact that it took place at all. More could have been made of the summit. I think the purpose of the summit was there to set an agenda for humanitarian action to collectively address the most pressing humanitarian challenges. However, I think not having a major part of it, non-state actors, which have been playing an integral role in allowing or preventing humanitarian operations in conflict from Syria to Yemen to Somalia, Colombia, Central African Republic, they were not involved in the pre-consultations or the consultations leading up to the summit. I think there wasn't enough work done on the potential impact of counter-terrorism legislation and a better understanding of how do we engage with non-state actors to get a better understanding of what drives them and what we can push back on. I mean, all that said, I think there's been a lot of great work done on research and policy carried out with many parts of the humanitarian world, including Geneva Call and the OCHA peer-to-peer, the NGOs such as Norwegian Refugee Council, as well as I think the Humanitarian Policy Group, the ODI, and the Chatham House International Law Programme. Just to name a few, these are the places you would go and get much more information on working engagement with non-state actors. I think in practice, as humanitarians, the range of crisis interventions we are working on are no longer short-term ones. Many of the cases of these current emergencies are long-standing, in some cases infinite. I mean, tellingly, across the 10 largest humanitarian operations, we've been on the ground an average of 36 years. And obviously, we face a much more polarised and new world disorder. We face it in Palestine and Yemen, in places where I've worked most recently. And the humanitarian work we often do is often driven by member states' political considerations. And for ourselves, our own struggle is politics over humanity. And I think increasingly humanity loses out more often than not. I mean, looking at Palestine, I mean, if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most intractable of our time, the humanitarian situation it has produced over the many years is certainly one of the most complex, the most protracted and entrenched. And in such a polarised and visceral environment, the line between addressing the long-term humanitarian consequences of the conflict, in this case, the cumulative effect of almost a half a century of occupation, and being seen to stand in judgment over its causes can quickly become very blurred. Humanitarian organisations working in Palestine cannot afford to stray across the line into the domain of politicians and peacemakers, at least if they want to be accepted across the board within an approach that's credible and relevant. One false step in this minefield, be it in actions or words, can set off charges of bias and prejudice and ultimately stymie humanitarian access to people in urgent need of protection and humanitarian assistance, whatever side of the front line they may be on. And this is true in armed conflicts around the world, although in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, where perspectives of national identity, history and politics and humanitarian suffering and human suffering have all become so intertwined that the path of neutrality has been as delicate as has been crucial. And yet I think the neutrality and the independence and impartiality risks becoming an empty mantra unless the humanitarian response is seen also to be effective and difficult in an environment. In Palestine, the humanitarian community tries to prevent any backlash, and it's interesting to assess the amount of time we spend as UN agencies and NGOs on fact-checking, devoting equal amounts of time on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side in any reports we write, trying to address the complaints that are come along all the time, which tie us up in terms of what we do and our capacities. This has led to a sort of a self-censoring, and I would also say an almost a kind of dangerous silence against some of the violations that are taking place. I think where we are right now in this current time, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has been emboldened by the support he's received from Washington. And I think that's put him in a very strong position vis-a-vis the US Embassy move to Jerusalem, the annexation of the Golan, the funding cuts to UNRWA, and the Palestinian Authority, and many other things. The recent release of the Trump plan is, I think, wholeheartedly welcomed by the government of Israel, but not others. And on paper is designed to bring massive gains in terms of annexing land for Israel and the recognition of illegal settlements as such. And I think that the maps that they put out initially suggested many areas will be taken away from the West Bank. I think the stark unspoken truth is that the receding prospect of a two-state settlement, accelerated by any move to implement the Trump plan, will slowly erode the generosity of international donors, humanitarian donors that is. As it happens, what we would like to remain is a set of programmes meekly underwriting what is sometimes misleadingly called economic peace. The programmes that involve funding for humanitarian purposes, security and modest economic development, as well as an expectation of Palestinian acquiescence to a continued Israeli occupation. I mean, there are very few places as surreal as the occupied Palestinian territory when it comes to the issue of humanitarian work and access. Whereas Yemen has a diverse and distinct theatres of operation, be it in Sana'a, be it in Taiz, or be it in Aden or Hudaida, the stark difference between East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank and Gaza require almost separate responses entirely. And the peculiarities of Gaza make it all the more complicated. Gaza is a territory that's controlled by Hamas, a faction that is much of the donor community regards as a terrorist organisation. And from a political perspective, legitimate authorities are meant to be the Palestinian Authority, who were expelled in a violent takeover in 2007. And of course, Israeli as an occupying power is legally responsible for the enclave and its 2 million inhabitants. Some 80% of the population in Gaza and the Strip rely entirely on international assistance of some kind, and the unemployment hovers around 50% of all the population. In some cases, under 30s, it's up to 70%. And the UN in 2012 wrote a landmark report that Gaza would be unlivable in 2020. And COVID-19 aside, where we are today, that's it. It is unlivable in many, many ways, because of the work quality, the quality of life, and the service delivery in general, and the poverty that exists. I mean, Gaza is under a blockade from air, from sea, and land by Israel, with heavily controlled and regulated borders. Energy and water supplies are totally insufficient, and health system teeters on the verge of collapse. In order to get anything inside, you need to ensure appropriate clearances from the Palestinian Authority, who, despite being present on the ground inside, still control the crossing points. And Hamas, so that they're once inside, it goes all to the right places. And of course, Israel will control the land crosses from their side. So it's a difficult negotiation process of any kind. While there is a border with Egypt, the humanitarian international assistance is only allowed through the border under very exceptional circumstances. It only comes through Kerem Shalom and other Israeli border, Palestinian borders. A result of our operations require close coordination with all three entities. That's the Hamas, Palestinian Authority, and Israel. Easy enough, except that many of the donors also require assurances that their assistance will not benefit Hamas. So with all of this, Gaza is the type of place where the clearances to distribute humanitarian aid takes on more time and more effort than the actual distribution itself. In Gaza, we have Hamas as the de facto authority, as the non-state actor. We have a long-standing no-contact policy, as Hamas is declared as a terrorist organisation. Any dealing with Hamas is against counterterrorism legislation, hence raising all the compliance issues. Thus, I mean, I think many of the UN political arm for us, the Norway and the Swedes, talk to the political side of the system, to the Hamas. UN is viewed as a political entity. I mean, obviously UNRWA has a long-standing relationship with Gaza and the West Bank. It's been there for decades. Other UN agencies or NGOs are not as fully recognised or understood by Hamas. And this sometimes could be awkward in terms of trying to make progress. I mean, the last big war in Gaza was 2014. It resulted in over 2,000 deaths and some 10,000 injuries, and more than 11,000 destroyed homes and a lot of damage to key infrastructure. The cost of damage was estimated in billions, and under established procedures, there was no way a relief effort could take place, given the massive need for cement and other heavily controlled goods, part of the dual-use list materials controlled by Israel. So after the 2014 war, together with the Palestinian Authority in Israel, the UN created a mechanism that would give both governments, none of them present on the ground by the way, an equal say in what entered and what was the purpose. It was called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism. It was one of the most intricate arrangements I've seen, whereby all concerned goods assigned to a specific project and then monitored by a team on the ground to ensure that they're appropriate end use. I mean, at this point, Hamas had no choice but to engage. Most people were not pleased with the reconstruction mechanism. Human rights people said it reinforced the blockade. The private sector and project managers used to dealing with Israelis directly had to deal with the Palestinian Authority, a government that was not present actually in Gaza. And in the end, it did work for its intended purposes. Reconstruction has been largely completed, and this could not have happened without the creation of this liaison mechanism, this reconstruction mechanism. Whether it had a purpose or not anymore is a question, especially in the Palestinian Authority has now adopted a largely negative approach to Gaza through a series of overt and more covert sanctions towards Gaza itself. But with regard to the humanitarian situation specifically, the mechanism facilitated repairs and reconstruction of water treatment, sewage and desalination, hospitals and health clinics, as well as the entry of items such as solar panels to power these installations. And I think it is a technical mechanism that allows for conversations in different ways between the parties. And any technical conversation is much more depoliticized and is helpful. In Gaza, we've seen over the past 2 years since the Great March of Return demonstrations started every Friday, They've gone on they're stopped at the moment. And this has created tension and volatility that then we always found ourselves not so very far away from another repeat of the 2014 war. The UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East, Nikolai Mladenov, has often stated in his regular meetings, regular Security Council briefings, that over the past 2 years, they've been very close to tipping over the edge into more extreme violence. The weekly demonstrations at the fence on Friday have resulted in over 30,000 people injured and almost 8,000 shot, with over 200 dead. And there are over 1,500 people, young people for the most part, with lower limb injuries as a result of being shot, and will require very massive and intricate repeat surgeries over the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, I think in general in Gaza, among the young people, there's a great deal of despondency and despair over the future. And they can see other people the same age on social media when they turn on their phones or their laptops, living a normal life in Europe. And they actually crave for that. And they don't have the dreams that other people their own age have. In the past 2 years, there have been many occasions where rockets were fired indiscriminately into Gaza, from Israel into Gaza. And there are many incidents of retaliatory airstrikes by the Israeli military forces inside Gaza itself. So that's been a constant part of the landscape here in Gaza for many of the last few years. I think the recent history of Gaza offers a grim warning of severe consequences that can follow when international assistance declines and is divorced from politics. When Hamas took over in 2007, the PA split between Hamas-controlled Gaza and the Fatah-controlled West Bank. As the two-state diplomacy began to lose traction, international actors simply postponed efforts to address the problem. Some international assistance continued to flow into Gaza, but as was seen as in humanitarian context, it's less. Politics and mediation are limited currency at the moment in the Palestine context. Direct Palestinian-Israeli talks are frozen, and the intra-Palestinian schism is ever widening between Hamas and Gaza and Fatah and Ramallah. COVID might offer an opportunity to address that differently, let's see. Most donors avoid supporting financial institutions and politics more broadly. Attention, diplomatic energy and funds shifted elsewhere, primarily to the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority there. And away from Gaza, and after more than a decade, the results are clear. In Gaza, disastrous humanitarian conditions, radicalization, periodic bouts of violence and escalations. And rather than an actual peace process, the negotiations that take place between Israeli and Palestinians alternate between containing violence and threatening it. Egypt and the UN have been very much involved in the negotiations to try and bring the two sides, Gaza, Hamas and Fatah and Ramallah together, not with a great deal of success at the moment, it should be said. I mean, as humanitarians and as work in any context, we need to meet with the people who control territories. In the case we do meet with the Hamas liaison people, technical people, ministry level, but also in my job as a humanitarian coordinator, I have to meet with the military intelligence and the politicians when there are major issues to resolve. On a more technical operation level, we work with them as would they do in any non-state actor, as they have obligations as an authority in a place like Gaza. To do that, the UN, we created a red line document on what we needed to do, what they needed to do. And that was to try and manage expectations, to have a technical conversation on things that matter to them because they want some sort of recognition. Hamas are looking for legitimacy, which obviously we in the humanitarian world, we don't offer that or recognition, and nor do we want to treat them like a government. What we do, we offer some sort of regular communication with them, and in order to build trust and enhance mutual understanding, so they will not block our movements and our exit and entry into Gaza and do the work we need to do for the population there. And I think in that regard, we have to listen to Hamas and we have to listen to their concerns. We have to seize the opportunity to remind them of their obligations under international humanitarian law. This is something on which we've been trying to work on a regular basis. I mean, Hamas, as a political and a military outfit, are not fully aware of the humanitarian system, how the different organisations cooperate and organise themselves, how we operate, why we operate. They don't know the governance structures. And so, but regardless of the optics, we need to build trust, especially for UN agencies and NGOs who've arrived in Gaza for humanitarian reasons since the early 2000s. UNRWA has been there for a lot longer. It's a long-standing service provider in Gaza and the West Bank. and has a different status and perception than the newer organisations who have arrived. And it's important that Hamas better understand these changes in order for us to try and improve trust and to make sure we've got a more consistent level of access. The current, I think the international community's no contact policy with Hamas, I mean, to me in this day and age doesn't really make sense. I mean, we see this in the light of mediation and diplomatic outreach and the inclusion of Taliban in Afghanistan with conversations with the US and others. I mean, what marks Hamas as different in that regard? I'm not quite sure. With the Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah, recent history shows that they could be more supportive to the needs in Gaza than is the case at the moment, given the overwhelming humanitarian socio-economic situation that's there. The international donor support for Palestine has been diminishing overall since 2012. The Palestinian Authority often views the international community as competition. I mean, given this overall diminishing donor funding, but also in light of their own limiting or the cuts in their own budget support as well. The Palestinian Authority has been in difficult discussions with Israel for some time over tax revenue collected by Israel for the Palestinian Authority that's been held back in an amount, you know, connected to the prisoner payments the Palestinian Authority makes. So there's a significant percentage of Palestinian Authority's budget is missing from that source. And it's been a regular occurrence, and government salaries don't get paid in full. Services are delivered in a limited way. And the recently, and especially in light of the COVID-19 outbreak, the transfer of funds from Israel to the Palestinian Authority has improved relations between both parties in a much more collaborative approach. In terms of the Israeli government, it's operating via a purposeful fragmentation. They deal with us through different levels of liaison, technical, operational. They deal with us through the civilian arm of the defence forces. We don't see the security apparatus who control the access and the entry. We don't see military intelligence and other ones who control all the movements. And the fragmented approach to in the contact with us, I don't think allows us to have the optimal possibilities for a more consistent and positive access and movement around. The fragmentation suits, I think, Israeli more than it suits us. And I think we need to, this COVID experience has shown that we can have a much more sort of positive cooperation and collaboration with the different aspects and different elements of the Israeli authorities. So we hope we can build on that. I mean, we are supported and encouraged by the Israeli government because they recognise the importance of the humanitarian assistance that goes into Gaza. I think it keeps a modicum of pressure down. And we have good interface with the technical levels of the government, with the government of Israel, who are the most part, willing to facilitate our work both in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, we do spend a lot of time, and especially some NGOs and UN agencies working in the protection and legal field, pushing back on a lot of false allegations which are created by a well-organised set of Israeli NGOs. Our operational space is reduced by the severe scrutiny of some of these very active non-governmental organisations in Israel with links to the government who issue reports and allegations causing the humanitarian organisations fingered or labelled to spend a lot of time addressing often unfound allegations, which is costly. And as humanitarians, we welcome any type of scrutiny, I think, if it leads to a much more effective and efficient response. But instead, we end up using much needed staff capacity and resources to push back on these allegations, so it doesn't make us more effective and more responsive to the crisis. Again, we have witnessed many different types of collaboration over the COVID-19 response. I think when the goal of the addressing the outbreak, the containment, the treatment is a common goal, it's there to defeat the virus that knows no borders, and no state can defeat it alone. So in that sense, we've a common purpose. And therefore, the fight against COVID-19, while it's a global challenge, requires a multilateral approach. We're benefiting from it locally on the ground because the parties are collaborating and cooperating in a good way. Now, let me move on to the Yemen situation. I mean, I'll just give you a background. I mean, the Yemen war was created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, with 70 to 80% of the population in need of humanitarian assistance, and over half of the 26 million people there face food insecurity and the threat of famine, and there's a regular cholera outbreak based on systems collapse. Local fighting escalated into full-blown war in March 2015 when a Saudi-led coalition intervened on behalf of the internationally recognised government of President Hadi against an alliance of Houthi militias with the former President Saleh. The conflict has fragmented a weak state destroyed by the country's meagre infrastructure and opened vast opportunities for many terrorist-affiliated groups to grow and seize territory, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. One of the newest humanitarian crises in comparison to the decades-old crisis in Palestine. The legitimate government of Yemen is outside in Riyadh and sometimes the base in Aden in the southern Yemen. I was regularly criticised as the humanitarian coordinator for being silent on Houthis and by being present in Sana'a and not having the UN office set up in Aden in the south. The government was very critical of the way we worked with the Houthis, noting that we didn't call them out often enough. And the legitimate government were unable or unwilling to comprehend the humanitarian dimension of the international community's role in Yemen and why we were there when 80% of the needs in the population were the northern half of the country where the Houthis controlled. The UN, we tried to meet with the recognised government of Yemen on a regular basis, both in Aden and Riyadh. We informed them, wrote reports, sent them letters, reminding them of their responsibilities and reinforcing our position of neutrality and impartiality. You know, for me and others, there was a few times of being PNG'd as part of their unhappiness with the way we operated in the northern part of the country. The Saudi-led coalition was made up of the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, United Emirates, with support from the UK and US. It was a curious composite, I would say, and the interaction we had with them was not very coherent or unified. It was a compromise to take funds from all of these same parties who were behind the Saudi-led coalition, creating the crisis of the humanitarian. But we did it in a pragmatic way. It was important that we also took the money, but we also reminded them of obligations they had under international law, and we did that on a regular basis. Unfortunately, as the war went on, access to Yemen via air, land and sea was controlled by the Saudi-led coalition. Access for donors and media became very politicised, and also humanitarian access in the country was always a challenge, getting into the country, but also within the country itself. I had to meet the people from the Houthis on a regular basis. I met them in very different environments and offices. I often met them mostly late at night in the south of the city of Sana'a, where they were outside chewing cats. We tried to get them to understand what we were there about and to listen respectively to what they had to say and ask us. We didn't have to agree, but we had to listen, and asking for compliance with Security Council resolutions meant the end of any Houthi, which was set about to end Houthi reign in Sana'a, was a non-starter. So we had to change the whole framing with them. We had a political mission there, and you had a humanitarian mission. We had to give them some sort of recognition for the fact that they provided security for us, both inside Sana'a and as we worked within the northern part of the country. I think it was important to recognise it as well. I did a lot of work with the media, regionally, internationally, and I had monthly press briefings in Sana'a because the media were blocked from coming in to the northern part of Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition. Sana'a airport was closed to commercial flights, and we were preventing for allowing media on our aircraft. And therefore, the messages were not getting out unless we did a lot of work to try and be proactive with the media, because there was no way the world was getting the full story. I took part in TV panel discussions with the legitimate government of Yemen from Riyadh and elsewhere to try and counter the complaints against the UN and the space we were trying to create here to carry out much needed humanitarian operations. There were no donor representatives in Yemen, and trying to get member states into Yemen was not easy because of all of the sanctions and the issues, but we had a low-level series of visits. We had weekly virtual humanitarian plus meetings with donors and member states, including those who were part of the Saudi-led coalition. We did that from Riyadh and Amman into Sana'a, and it included places like London. And I also spent a lot of time in key capitals, Europe and the US, and in the region to raise the humanitarian protection concerns. Trying to create political change within Congress and Parliament in the US and UK respectively was not easy when the crisis was not just seen always in the same way as a humanitarian crisis. In many cases, Yemen was closely interwoven in the politics of the region and also in that ways of how some of these member states wanted to strengthen their own position and connections in the region. And at the same time, a strong influence on trade, including the arms industry. As in any context, Yemen and the Houthis were no different, that they had to be more consultations in the context as we as humanitarian needed to operate within the scope and the domain of non-state actors. I think the research has shown us that despite the many different types of non-state actors on the ground, the diversity, there is a high degree of sort of uniformity in many of the views expressed on the range of issues related to humanitarian action and access. Much of the research that's out there shows that they see value in humanitarian actions, obviously in broad terms, as alleviating suffering and providing relief to those affected by armed conflict and natural disaster within their own area of control. And in the case of the Houthis and Hamas, a way to exert control was to be part of an international effort to control, to bring rewards to populations under the control, and by appearing to give permission for access and movement for goods to affected areas and affected populations. With the Houthis, we established a number of mechanisms to regulate our contact. That was a lot easier because it was safer, and to maintain the technical nature of engagement as humanitarian community, and ultimately to track and get better results. And it gave the impression to the Houthis they had a bigger role or stake in the work we were trying to undertake. I mean, we set up mechanisms which were sort of technical, neutral mechanisms. One of them was an access monitoring reporting framework. This was a tool for gathering information on various access constraints faced by UN and NGOs, national and international. It's a very simple online tool. All partners, national and international, fed the information into this framework, reporting framework, and we used it to build a comprehensive understanding of the type of issues that were emerging, we were facing, who was causing them, where were they being caused by. And while the Houthis controlled all of the northern part of the country, there were some unilateral action carried out by individual local commanders. And it was to bring that attention to SANA and help them undo or unlock that problem. We used it for evidence-based advocacy and engagement with the authorities on the overall movement and access issue. And it was facts-based, so it was not based on any emotions or political issues. We also created a humanitarian access working group, and that was the senior colleagues from the humanitarian organisations, and it used the information from the reports framework. And this was there to establish a sort of negotiation and engagement strategy at all levels, both in SANA, broader in Yemen, and obviously outside as well. We created slightly independent field hubs where we decentralised delegation of authority, and that allowed much more discussion and decision making at a regional level rather than being centralised. And that was then to try and counter this unilateral approach by some of the local commanders who took it upon themselves to try and interfere or divert where they could and where they managed. And then what we did at a more central level was to create a one window mechanism for the humanitarian organisations to engage with the authorities on different access issues and bring about a more systematic dialogue with the authorities on all the access issues we faced, using the access monitoring framework, which gathered all the information. We brought that on a regular basis, and we went through this one window, which was the authorities' mechanism of all the key line ministries, and that's the place where we parked all of our concerns. And then we used that to package an advocacy message to the political elements of Houthi and the people in the Prime Minister's office as well. I mean, very often non-state actors only refer to assistance, while the protection of its civilians and some of the protection issues and human rights that they don't want to discuss. In the Yemen context, each quarter I sent a letter to the Houthis and separately to the legitimate government, outlining a list of protection incidents, trends and violations that have happened over that period of time. We forward these letters to the relevant embassies, including those in the Saudi-led coalition. But then we also made sure that the Houthis only saw the allegations against them, and the government of Yemen only saw the allegations attributed to them as well. There was no cross-referencing, so it kept things easier. I mean, I think available research shows that non-state actors see a direct link between the transparency and the confidence in the quality of assistance on the one hand, and the humanitarian agency, the operations, the way we work and the way we handle and respect the principles of neutrality, impartiality and independence on the other. In the case with the Houthis, the motivation was to prevent humanitarian actors being independent and having free access and movement. This was based on viewing humanitarian assistance as something that was very Western, and it was not. They didn't understand humanitarian assistance as Houthis because it was new to them. They understood the charitable concept and the Islamic culture, which is zakat, but the way we did it was quite alien to them. This was based on, I think, a lack of trust and suspicion of our motives, given that the majority of our funds came from member states who were supportive of or directly involved in the Saudi-led coalition. And Hamas, on the other hand, have much more experience in dealing with international actors because they've been working in the environment for a much longer time and dealing with international community, whereas Houthis had maybe strong relations and allies in the region. They didn't have the same degree of understanding and experience with international community. And while Hamas were more secure and more assured of the position and don't feel threatened that they might control Gaza, this was not the case with Houthis, who were in an all-out struggle, and they saw what we were trying to do is almost like they viewed it originally as a Trojan horse and trying to come in here and create political change through the humanitarian world. As a result, the Houthis wanted much more control of our work, the movement of humanitarians, and they basically viewed our work, our humanitarian delivery, primarily through the security threat lens. So Hamas were trying to seek some sort of form of recognition from our dealings with them. If nothing else, they control the movements in and out of Gaza and our movement and Strip itself. I mean, they have these strong relations with Egypt and Qatar and other parts of the region, and many of the leaders meet with people in Russia and other Muslim countries as well. COVID-19, I think, has maybe provided an opportunity for Hamas to gain even more traction. As humanitarians, we have to be smart and avoid getting embroiled in the political attempts underway to create divisions between West Bank and Gaza. And so it's important that we stay humanitarian and be recognising the political constraints and the complexities, but be very single-minded. I think to this end, we in the international community, we work through and with the Palestinian Authority when it comes to issues in Gaza, where we understand the difficulties of the Palestinian Authority having exerting force and power over what happens inside Gaza. For the most part, I think non-state actors are broadly familiar with the core humanitarian principles. But I think on the independence of our assistance, I think people like Houthis and other non-state actors suspect that the geopolitical concerns and the fundings and other factors challenge the ability of the humanitarian actors to be actually independent in practice. I think with all of the principles, the focus is always on the way we behave rather than on the agency's funding, where it comes from. So I think it's important that we act independently and impartial and neutral, while they might view us as we know where your money comes from, you know where your leanings are. Both Hamas and Houthis know where our funding comes from, and they often, sometimes ideologically at odds with where they are, but at the same time there's a pragmatic acceptance of what it is we do and why we do it. I think we have to understand better how some of these groups, these non-state actors, view humanitarian action, including access and principles. And I think it'd be quite a challenge, but I think it would be immensely beneficial to sit down with Hamas and Houthi at the right level and have discussions on the more policy and legal issues rather than just operations and movement and access, including obviously security concerns. We often substitute this conversation with training on international law and practice. And we know that non-state actors at times, they conflate some of the principles, notably neutrality and impartiality, and they seek to co-opt humanitarian aid or otherwise to undermine the principles for their own benefit. And I think even some member states do that as well from time to time. The widespread knowledge about the rules of international humanitarian law governing our work, humanitarian access, is a more problematic issue, and I think has to be addressed through different contexts. It's not enough that non-state actors understand and can rhyme off the humanitarian principles. I think that there's a requirement to have a dialogue and a dissemination, as well as training, that these groups, non-state actors, the leadership, but also the rank and file members understand their obligations concerning access, and not only that, implement them in practice. This is something we've tried and tried to do with the Houthis and with the Hamas on more often case. I mean, Hamas are a long-established body with a conflict raging for many, many years, and the regular interaction through line ministries at the technical level. They understand better how the international humanitarian works, the role of the UN, especially UNRWA, the donors and the key donors and the NGOs. It doesn't mean they agree, but it means that there are relationships and exposure to humanitarian principles that have grown over the years. It doesn't always result in compliance and access facilitation, and often results in disruption and blockages with humanitarian work sometimes viewed as the arm of foreign governments and based on political considerations. I mean, it's hard to avoid this opinion when you think of most recently what's happened, especially the recent cut of funds to UNRWA from the US and the politicisation of the Palestinian Authority's support to Gaza. But it doesn't mean that our work is stymied, rather that it's highly regarded and appreciated, and it helps the people of Gaza. And that in itself, I think, legitimises in a certain way Hamas's control of the area. But we have to, it's something we're stuck in this sort of quandary-like situation. I think Hamas, from my experience, have a very limited understanding of the way the international community functions. They have little experience in statecraft and diplomacy, and not surprising, they've only been in this war for 5 years, 5 long, tough years. The diplomacy was always the purview of the President Saleh component of the Sana alliance. But however, as the balance of power swung more in favour of the Houthis following the death of Saleh and the reduction of the power of the Saleh wing, there was the suspicion of the UN and international community was always there. Our optics were not helped when in the UN we returned in mid-2017. We took over as our residency the US Embassy Diplomatic Transit Facility, the old Sheraton Hotel. Interestingly, one of my first encounters with the Houthi military intelligence, they said to me that I worked for the United Nations of America. So they have their optic was very negative of the UN. The fact that we left as well when the war kicked off was not helpful. So what I saw as one of my first tasks was to find a way to move out of the US embassy facility to a new residential compound for the UN staff to live. I think to try and change that negative optics. During the preparation for the move to the new compound, and once we left the US compound, the optics and almost the attitude towards the UN changed by the Houthis. And they were able, I think, to better understand that we were much more independent in the political side of things. And I think we also gave the impression that we appeared to be listening to the Houthis and we took their advice. In several cases, I think non-state actor research shows that that they feel that humanitarian organisations have not engaged with them in an appropriate, proactive and impartial manner enough. In some contexts, engagement is hindered by external political pressures, I mentioned, resulting in serious consequences for aid workers and civilians alike. As is the case of Hamas, with some states, including donors, have listed them along with other movements as a terrorist group, which has led some agencies to avoid direct engagement with them for fear of falling afoul of counterterrorism legislation and all of the consequences that come with that. Aid agencies elsewhere feel that engaging with non-state actors could lead to expulsion from areas under government control, and that does happen. These are dilemmas to which there are no easy fixes, and there needs to be a negotiation on the ground and a more flexible and pragmatic, if not discreet, approach from member states in doing the labelling of those NGOs and those bodies as terror organisations will be helpful. The bottom line, however, is that not engaging or having a limited ad hoc engagement with non-state actors ultimately hinders the need for agreement to comply with international humanitarian law. We need to be much more direct with them if we're going to get compliance with international law, and for them to receive and agree their own obligations. And if we avoid or contact or engagement, it can be seen by or perceived by the non-state actor that the humanitarian actors are abandoning our own humanitarian principles, and we are viewed or seen as operating in a non-neutral or partisan way. To that end, I think aid agencies must invest in relationship building with all parties to armed conflict and develop strategic engagements with non-state actors. I think this would be best served where possible by the resident humanitarian coordinator. Under the new reformed resident coordinator system, there's a direct reporting line within the UN Secretariat, making the resident coordinator position much more a political role. And by taking on the responsibility to consult with non-state actors, I think helps to protect or buffer against with those operational agencies and organisations whose own roles or positions or work could be jeopardised by the criticism of meeting with non-state actors. But this also has to be fully agreed and accepted by the UN, NGOs and management at capital and headquarters levels. There needs to be a level of certainty and commitment from headquarters that resident humanitarian coordinators will be supported fully if negative voices and criticism of this outreach to non-state actors or terrorist organisations is brought to the attention of the world through criticism in both mainstream and social media. I believe that my own attempts in trying to reach out with the Houthis or Hamas has resulted in a more consistent and sustained access for our work. And with trust building and conversations being broader in range, we'll be able to see a much more, I think, consistent approach to international humanitarian law. And I think at the same time, I think it would help working and negotiating with non-state actors and try to get a much more consistent type of humanitarian access. Non-state actors must recognise and witness that humanitarians should behave in ways that they demonstrate completely through transparency and otherwise obvious means their commitment and demonstrate their adherence to neutrality, impartiality and independence. Any perception that humanitarians are not adhering to these principles can have really dangerous consequences, ranging from denial of access to even attacks on aid workers, their property and diversion. I think this underscores the importance of humanitarians not only behaving in accordance with the humanitarian principles, but also carefully monitoring and managing the non-state actors' perceptions of them in order to avoid any misunderstandings. And that's all about communications and information. I think this is key to building trust and acceptance between parties to conflicts and securing safe access without compromising principles. But it's also about being pragmatic and smart. It means sometimes being proactive in informing the non-state actor, the Hamas or the Houthis, before the fact, not seeking their permission, but rather informing them. And in some cases, using their technical staff to participate in joint assessments to build trust and an understanding and a confidence that we are doing our work properly. But it doesn't mean that they have any involvement in deciding the types of interventions, the locations for interventions, or in fact, any of the beneficiary choices we make. From the Houthi point of view, they did not trust the UN. The UN support was part of a pre-war national dialogue, and that after the Security Council resolution of 2216, which ultimately didn't work. This resolution was deliver a 6 months quick win to return back to normal and reinstall a legitimate government in Sana'a. It didn't work, and the war rages on. But all of this added to the suspicion of the UN, and it took some time to educate and convince the Houthis that the Security Council was not overseeing or directing our humanitarian work on the ground, nor was the political part of the the political part of the UN, the special political mission. We were distinct and separate. Otherwise, it would have been a constant battle, and we would have been basically locked as humanitarians, seen in a position we couldn't move from. And then we would be seen to be tainted in the eyes of the Houthis because what was being instrumentalised. I did a lot of work and discussions with them to try and build trust with the different parts of the Houthis on negotiation of access, creating red lines in operations, fostering a better understanding of what their obligations were under international human law and how they could interfere with our work if they were seen as the controllers of the territory. To do that, it was basically the interface for the country team so that the operations were not jeopardised or not interfered with. This was not easy because it was a big humanitarian operation there with many, many parts and many layers of it. There was the added problem that the ministers were actually, the ministries that we worked with were overseen by President Saleh in the former regime, which were often at odds with the Houthi commanders and the people, the politicals who controlled the access to the ground. So where you had agreement from sort of a like-minded Saleh group, they were not often at odds with the Houthis themselves. So we had to be very sensitive in the discussions we had and very sensitive in who we spoke to. Although non-state actors have obligations under international humanitarian law, that they're not part of any legal framework or treaties. But at the same time, I think that while that's the case, it shouldn't then prevent them or neglect them from respecting the law and demonstrating their work to compliance with adherence to it. It's also important that the orientation of leadership takes place and training is offered to lower ranking field staff. And it's best to use actual local examples. When there has been a problem locally, as I mentioned, we have this monitoring framework. When we bring up an issue, And we can use that as part of the discussion around that issue, so it's real for them, and it it allows us to have a discussion around what caused the problem and what is the solution. And I think each of those incidents should offer an opportunity to remind the parties of their obligations, their roles, and it reinforces the message we can give. And it creates, I think, an illusion that they are part of something, and they think they're part of what we're trying to do, which is helpful, but not always the case. It's not easy. It's not an easy conversation to have with non-state actors or de facto authorities. Bringing criticism to them is not easy. Sometimes not easy to deliver. You know, they're looking for recognition, looking for some sort of respect and legitimacy for the way they interact with us, from the way they perform, the way they provide security and safe passage. By bringing criticism to you can often take that good relationship off the table. And so we have to be careful how you venture into a conversation with non-state actors on their obligations under international law. It can be tricky conversations and needs to be thought out tactfully when is the right time to discuss it? What's the right type of issue to put on the table? Who do you bring it to? At what point do you bring it? Do you bypass your regular interlocutor and go higher? As was the case with both Houthis and Hamas, they wanted something often in writing to us to help confer acceptance and even some type of legitimacy. I mean, for me, it was just a matter of putting together a red lines document that laid out standing operating procedures, reminding them of the international principles that we work with, the obligations that we have. And it doesn't have any reference, it doesn't have any headed notepaper, and doesn't have any signatures, but it's a point of technical discussion where they feel as though that they are participating in the creation of a document. And so I find, finally, I think non-state actors in the studies we've seen often refer to political issues when asked to make recommendations on how to improve humanitarian conditions. Many see humanitarian crises and needs rooted in conflicts that only ultimately have a political solution. And while that's beyond the scope of a lot of the research, we can't avoid that. We have to understand that across conflicts, that the roots of humanitarian crisis are very political by nature, and the resolution will have to be political. And that's where we have a problem, because we're there with the UN and others, providing a humanitarian, where the other parts of the system are looking for a political solution. And maybe in conclusion, and bringing it back to where I started, the current COVID-19 outbreak, I think the international community in the Palestinian context should explore the possibilities of opening up a space for greater cooperation between Gaza and Israel, in order to achieve a much more effective coordination in the response to the COVID-19 crisis in Gaza. Because I think that's where the big problem will rise, given the complex and complicated nature of the operating environment and the overcrowding and the weak health systems. I think in addition, we should use the COVID crisis, as a means to reduce the current tensions between Ramallah and Gaza, to avert any risk of impeding rather than facilitating an effective response to the current crisis. I think in the past week there have been exchanges with all stakeholders at technical level, but it's acknowledged that there's a need to extend these discussions to the political level to ensure the right level of response to the growing humanitarian crisis, and more importantly, I think beyond this, to provide the basis for better and future development of discussions. Anyway, I'll close there, and I hope you found some of my practical examples helpful. And many thanks again to Ireland at the Fordham International Lecture Series, and Fordham University Institute for International Humanitarian Affairs for this opportunity to talk about some of my own personal experiences. Thanks very much.